Hey there, everyone. Welcome to our notes. These are the penultimate notes. That's a fancy English word for the one before the last. So today, our focus, or rather, these notes that we're looking at right now, are for chapters 11 and 12, and then 13 and 14 will be their own separate thing. So, in particular, so this week, this content stuff, so obviously, in case it's not obvious, uh, we're going to be talking about delinquency again, continuing. But in particular, we're talking about prevention and police engagement. So in particular, we're looking at how. So obviously, just real quick, this is chapter 11. This is chapter 12. But so we are going to be looking at continuing our discussion on delinquency and delinquency trends. But instead of looking at the factors that influence this, now we're going to be looking at prevention programs and styles that are out there, as well as how law enforcement police groups engage with juvenile delinquents. And then the final two chapters are going to look at the court structure, the juvenile justice court, as well as juvenile corrections. So that'll wrap us up. But anyway, the first part we're going to be looking at delinquency prevention. We're looking at chapter 11. And the entire concept, and it's important to note when we talk about prevention, prevention is inherently, and this is important, this is going to be something that comes up, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Prevention is intervening before an actual any kind of delinquency. So it's important to note prevention is intervening before delinquency. The idea is that to have prevention, you're stopping it from even starting. And that's where we have this other issue, and that is delinquency control. And that is something that this text, this chapter in particular, looks at. And control is reaction. It's reaction to delinquency and reducing. Delinquency. So the idea there is that control, or another word for control, repression. You're repressing delinquency. This whole idea is you've at least been introduced into the juvenile system, and the idea is to reduce the chances, to bring them down to a lower number, hopefully eventually to zero. So that is the big excuse me, that is the big difference between delinquency prevention and delinquency control, or delinquency repression. Prevention happens before an act ever begins. Control is a reaction to delinquency after that initial one, and it's looking to reduce the numbers. So that is the important distinction. So, in particular, Chapter 11 is looking in particular at prevention strategies, not control strategies, not repression, prevention. That is the dream goal. That is the social work aspect of it. That is the, if we can prevent it from happening, we don't need as much of the control aspect. And so that's why it's important to note this. Important to note, just because the goal is prevention doesn't mean that that is the only answer. And just because we currently have mostly control type programming and things like that doesn't mean that that's the only way. And so if you are interested, I will definitely suggest and direct you towards, in our textbook, and I'm going to write that down, Exhibit 11.1 on page 299. This is a delinquency prevention versus control chart. It looks at some prevention strategies and then control strategies. And it's important to note that this is a good way to understand how the two vary. And so I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. So prevention methods are things like home visitation, preschool mentoring programs, whereas control is anti-gang police task force, boot camps, and probation. So there's a clear distinction between reactive and being proactive. And that's kind of what I'm hoping that you can identify is that big piece. And so something that needs to be noted, and we kind of talked about it before and we teased it, and this chapter really dives into it, and that is one particular approach to juvenile delinquency and in particular prevention. Sorry for my sloppy writing. But one approach to delinquency prevention in particular is taking a public health approach. And if you're unsure what the heck this means, our textbook does dive into the different strategies and different ways in which, excuse me, delinquency prevention programs can be approached. But public health is, I would hope, would be straightforward and understandable. But the idea is that you treat delinquency as an infectious disease. So you treat it as it's something that you can't just simply get rid of. And so the way you have to do it is you have to break it into phases. So there are different steps that you do. So in public health, if you want to reduce an infectious disease, your first step is you have to, increase well-being and things like that. And then you start going into vaccinations, you start going into immunization, you go into education, and then finally, once all that's done, you go into that final stage is where, you're spreading that information, you're making it part of the culture, things like that. So the public health approach is very similar. So, or rather, sorry, the delinquency prevention way of approaching it like a public health concern is, again, phases. And so our textbook gives gives an example. And so this is right around, by the way, page 300 in our textbook. So phases, again, it goes into breaking it down to primary, secondary, and tertiary, in case you've not heard this term before. This is third level down, tertiary. So obviously, it should be pretty straightforward, but primary is what is the first step, what is the most important thing, and so this is in juvenile delinquency. We're looking at well-being. We're looking at what is available to potential juvenile delinquents in that nature. Secondary, we're looking at intervention with at-risk youth. So we're looking at those individuals who have the potential to join into juvenile delinquency. This is also things like where you start to introduce like neighborhood programs so that you can deter criminal behavior and activity. And then tertiary, this is where you're actually this is intervention again, but this is with current. So our text uses adjudicated juvenile offenders. So these are individuals who are already in the system. They have gone through the system at least once, and they're either currently engaged in it, so they are, in a rehabilitation center, they're in juvenile hall, they're in prison, whatever this may be, or they've been recently released. And the idea is this tertiary phase is where you treat those who are already in it and try to prevent that continuing, that default nature to just repeat the same thing over and over again. We've talked about this before. What do we call it? I'm giving you half a second, even though I'm, going to be saying it anyway. Recidivism. We're trying to reduce the repeat offense. So, approaching delinquency as public health means that the first step is not even addressing people who are currently in it. What we're doing is improving the general well-being of all juveniles, of all these neighborhoods, so that this is reducing that total number. Secondary level is having direct intervention with those who have the potential, and then the third level down, the tertiary level, is simply breaking it down and hitting those who are currently in the system. And so, like I said, that is one way in which we can approach juvenile delinquency and how to reduce those numbers and work with it. So another way, and it's kind of similar to public health, but another way is developmental. So hopefully this also should be pretty straightforward, but obviously developmental perspective, a developmental approach to juvenile delinquency and prevention looks at different theories. In particular, where's my mouse? So we've talked a little bit about these before. Not necessarily the theories, but how there are concepts like there are key moments throughout individuals' lifetimes, these key moments where impact and intervention can make a difference. This is one of those things that comes from developmental approach and developmental theories. The idea is that as you develop, as you get older and things of this nature, there are places where intervention would be most useful. And so that's really what the developmental approach is it's looking at those theories and going, when is the right time to identify potential risk factors and intervene to prevent this kind of thing. And so thinking about developmental as well as, oddly enough, public health, one thing that does really come up a lot, and that is early prevention. Or rather, early intervention. Early prevention is popular in particular because it addresses potential risks very early on in life and intervenes before any kind of delinquency can happen. But obviously, early prevention as a design, as a hope, is varies widely. That's what I'm trying to say. It varies widely. Early prevention is literally just so if our chapter that we're talking about right now is delinquency prevention, early prevention is the goal. That is the dream. That is intervening before delinquency has a chance. And so, like I said, there's a lot of sub ways that can happen. So I'm just going to list a couple. Sorry for the silence. I'm just trying to write some of these down. So before I go any further, I might as well explain a little bit. Some early prevention strategies are things that are like home-based uh, prevention strategies, like having professional visitations. And I don't mean like parental visitations where it's guided. No, I mean like a nurse or midwife or someone who is a trained professional, might even be like a social worker, comes into the home with a young developing mother, with a young child, an infant. The idea is that, according to the data, single mothers age 19 and lower, um, aren't properly trained, and so a lot of like nurses and social workers will do home visits, and that has shown to have a positive impact on this, where it's reduced potential delinquency, potential uh, issues that the parent may have or that the child could grow into. So that's what I mean by visitations. Parent training, this can be done again in a similar way with visitations. It can be classes that are offered elsewhere. It can be anything of that nature. But the idea is that there are, and I'm sure some of you, knowing the demographic of my students here in this class, I'm sure some of you would agree that not everyone is meant to be a parent and not everyone is trained to be a parent. I would argue most people aren't trained to be a parent. Um, Not that there is a one way training, but the idea is that some people need to learn a little bit more on how to be a parent. And so that's one way that we can actually have a positive early prevention strategy for delinquency. Uh, because if you think back several chapters, the first influence in children's lives as they develop and can potentially go to delinquency is the home life, is the family life. If a parent doesn't know how to parent, if they don't know how to raise their child, it can lead to delinquency. So that's what home based really is looking at, is things that happen and occur within the home. Um, so there is an example in particular of an improving parenting skill. It is on page 305 in our textbook, and it is the Oregon Social Learning Center. If you're if you're interested in more of that, you can actually look into it. I believe there's a link in the side of the page that talks about where you can learn more about it, but I went over the basics of this. And so this is something I might have a bias because I was a preschool kid. I also may have a bias because my partner currently works at a preschool, but the data shows that preschools do help, in particular with early prevention, because, and I want to emphasize, preschools are not cheap. Preschools and daycares, they're not cheap, and I know that that's frustrating and it's not possible for all parents. But the concept of a preschool or a daycare where it's similar to a preschool in design is that it teaches socialization, it teaches proper behavior, and it's also framed in a uh, school like design so that when a child does go off to school, they're already previously exposed to it and they know how you're supposed to respond. And this socialization means that you're not going to be antisocial or have those potential antisocial behaviors uh, by meeting with different kids and different perspectives and having different adults being an influence at the preschool level. This can also lead to a reduced opportunity to get into delinquent behaviors. So, preschools overall, and as we've talked about with school in general in that previous chapter, they do have a decent impact on developmental stages of children and youth as they grow up, especially when it comes to delinquency. So it's important to do that. And something to mention in particular with early prevention, uh, it's more of a just kind of reminder thing. Teenage intervention is still important. So I know that we're talking about preventing delinquency before it happens, and yeah, the data shows that the earlier you get involved, the less likely it's going to happen later. That's not to mean that you ignore teenagers. It's not the, oh, well, I got them in preschool and kindergarten and through primary school. Now they're 13. I don't need to worry about them anymore. No, it's still important to, reinforce and continue to support any kind of prevention strategy, even early prevention strategies, still at the teenage level. So while it's no longer preschool and it's not really, visitation or parent training, there should still be some kind of, uh, you know, additional work. And so this is where the extension of preschools come in, and the textbook does talk about it, and we've mentioned it before. Things like the Boys and Girls Club really are like programs designed to help reduce juvenile delinquency in young adults and teenagers, and uh, those who are in school age, but they're not quite like 4 and 5. Like it's meant for these individuals for that. But there is a really well known program that in particular is related to teenage intervention. And I will mention there's a lot of teenage intervention programs and strategies, but the big one that you've probably even heard of is mentoring programs. In particular, the big one in the American system is the Big Brothers and Big Sisters program. And so, if you're not familiar with this, the Big Brother and Big Sister program is a program designed where an individual who is a little bit older uh, volunteers and signs up to be a quote big brother or big sister to an individual who is in the program who is looking for that kind of role model to look up to. And so the adult in this situation acts in a supportive way, not as a parent, and that's important, not a parent, but as like an older sibling, someone who's looking out, offering advice and guidance and looking out for the well-being of the individual. That's the idea behind the Big Brothers and Big Sister program. Um, Mentorship, there is data that shows that mentorship overall has a very positive impact on delinquency as well as preparedness for individuals. But one of the most important things to note about this is the quality of the mentor has the biggest impact in regards to this. So this is both, how good of a mentor they are, how active they are, what they do, how frequently they talk with their mentee, things of that nature. So mentorship is important, and yeah, just having a mentor is already a potentially good thing. But if you have a bad mentor, it's not going to be the best. Good mentors help encourage that and encourage the growth. And then the other thing to note with this, the data also shows that mentorship program alone is not enough. When you combine it with other programs, that has the biggest impact on reducing juvenile delinquency. And so this is where we get into other types of programs. So, like I said, the biggest intervention program for teens in delinquency is mentoring programs, but there are also school programs, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then there's also another thing, which is job training, and we'll talk about that as well. So, when we talk about school programs, this is one of those things where I say our textbook doesn't even have a full list. I don't think anyone can have a full list. School programs exist and they vary widely. The big thing is the most common issue is they're not implemented enough, or frequently school programs are anti-bullying campaigns, they're after-school programs, they're pseudo mentorship programs with where a faculty or teacher works with a student directly. It's volunteer programs through the school. They are so widespread and vary in intensity that's part of why it struggles. Um, some potential school programs you might be kind of familiar with are DARE, and we talked about this in intro as well, but GREAT. Both are about drugs and gang violence and things like that. These were school programs. Yes, they were worked with juvenile justice officers, and that's kind of a weird little segue that we'll get into in a minute. But really, these school programs, the biggest issue was that they weren't done properly, or they weren't taught frequently enough. Anti-bullying campaigns, just because they say don't bully, how often do they do it? How often do they enforce it? There's a lot of issues with school programs, and sometimes it comes down to funding. Sometimes it comes down to ethics and beliefs of the school administration. There's a lot of factors. And so that brings us to not the last one, but the last one we're going to talk about, and that's job training. In particular, we're talking after school. Um, because we're not, suggesting teens skipping school to go work. That's not what they're saying. It's after you've finished your school day, you go and have some kind of job, even part time. And the idea is that, well, number one, you have fewer opportunities to engage in delinquent behavior because you're at work after school, and then you go home. Like, there's not enough time for you to actually engage in potentially illegal activities. But the other intentional and kind of cool thing is that an after school job offers job training, which means you're being prepared for the responsibilities of adult work after you've graduated, after you enter into the adult realm of society. Like, job training, yes, reduces your chance of delinquent opportunities, but it also increases your preparedness as an adult. So, something to think about, something to consider. Like I said, these are just some of the big ones that are prevention. Because, again, remember, our focus is on stopping it before it happens. Does that mean that these programs or after school jobs or things like that can't be done if an individual is already in the system? No. This can be done as a control method as well. The difference is these can all be done also before delinquency to help prevent it. So it's good to keep that in mind, that all of these strategies we talked about don't just apply to those who have not committed any kind of illegal activity. This is both for current juvenile delinquents and potential juvenile delinquents. All right. So the later part of the chapter 11, looks particularly at juvenile justice today, in particular the criminal justice aspect, the police departments, these things like that. And so realistically, the whole thing is juvenile justice oversees delinquent children and status offenders. And so, as we've already talked about before, delinquent children are under a particular age limit, typically 18, because that is the most commonly accepted legal adult age. Now, some states differ. Some say that 16, but in general, it's 18. But the other thing is status offenders. And we have talked about this before. We mentioned it in Intro to Criminal Justice. So if you haven't taken that class, that is something from there as well. But status offenders are not violent crimes, things of that nature. Status offenses are illegal activities that you need some kind of intervention or some kind of supervision. And so, actually, different states, like I said, have different max ages for juvenile, and they have different things. But a status offender are, oh gosh, I don't know what I just did there. So sorry. Status offenders, according to our book, can be broken down into a couple different groups that are, you know, acronyms because we like that. So PIN stands for Persons in Need of Supervision, and CHINS is Children in Need of Supervision. So status offenders, like I said, they're illegal activities, but they're not arson, rape, assault. It's not those cases. It's the little things. It's theft, petty theft in particular. Um, and so this is a how do I want to say this? Not in this week, but in chapters 13 and 14, we're going to be talking more about the process in depth. But so currently in our juvenile justice system and our criminal justice system as a whole, again, this is something that we have talked about in intro. Obviously, the process always begins with a report, but then we go into the investigation, and in particular with juveniles, as well as any kind of potential criminal. Detention comes after the investigation, and in particular, when we talk about juveniles, detention can be held in a facility, or there is, in particular for juveniles, we have it's just referred to as shelter, but this is really temporary foster care. So the idea is that during detention, if it is seen as more harm to place a juvenile into a criminal detention center or a facility, they will try to find a temporary home, whether that be their own home or they need to be placed in a different home because that might be why the case is going on, anything of that nature. Yeah, detention is that second step. So then we get into pretrial procedures. And again, we'll talk more about this in our chapter 13 stuff, but the pretrial procedures, this is all the normal stuff like plea bargaining, listing the crimes, etc. We've talked about it before in the larger system, but we'll be talking criminal justice, juvenile in next week's notes. But so in the juvenile system, the court trial itself, we call the adjudication phase or the adjudication step in the process. Like I said, it's just the trial itself. This is where the individual gets read all the things and puts in their plea and has the evidence presented, and that's when all that fun stuff happens. Then we get into disposition. And disposition is, in juvenile system, is the sentencing step. This is where the judge determines where the youth is going, if they're going into care, if they're going home, or if case is getting thrown out, whatever it may be. And then obviously the last phase, as always, is treatment. So this can be any kind of correctional treatment, whether that's in the system, whether that's in a particular place or it's in a different, whatever it may look like, that treatment is there. So some things to note is that treatment can be release. And so I'll tell you right now, this is something that is going to be on this week's quiz. This is me giving you the whole answer right away. This week in your quiz, and what'll end up showing up also on the final, is a question about the comparison between the larger criminal justice system and the juvenile justice system. And so there are, and this is super important, there are many similarities and many differences between the systems. There's a lot of common ground and common beliefs, structure, rules, all those things. There's a lot of similar pieces, but there's also things that are different. And one thing that we have talked about time and again, the juvenile justice system is very focused on rehabilitation. It might change, but that is the focus. The larger criminal justice system as a whole is very retribution based, very much getting something back for that crime. You get what you deserve kind of concept. That is the larger piece. And so, yes, that is a very important kind of identifier to say, is that, there is a very clear difference there. But I'm also telling you, on page 318, cannot emphasize this enough. On page 318, the entire page is Exhibit 11.3, and it is 2 lists. It is the similarities and differences between the juvenile justice system and the adult justice system. One of your essay questions on the final, one of your essay questions on your quiz is asking you to talk about the similarities and differences. I encourage you to look over that list to talk about some of those things. And so I'm going to just talk about a couple of them. So in both systems, the individual is supposed to and is required to have their Miranda rights given to them and informed of those rights. Just because it's a child does not mean that a juvenile doesn't have the right to know their own rights. They have to be read them. They have to be informed of them. But obviously a big difference is that in juvenile justice, in juvenile court, you have to fall under a certain age. In regular criminal justice court, in adult court, doesn't matter if you're 88, doesn't matter if you're 18. You can be tried for the same exact thing. Your age does not change what court you're in, unless you're under that legal age, and then it's in juvenile court. In general, juvenile courts are more private. They're not public hearings for pretty much the safety of the child. Like, that's kind of an important thing. Another piece with this is that, most juvenile proceedings are not considered criminal. Adult are. So these are things to think about. These are things to look at. Yeah. Page 318. I cannot emphasize it enough, especially since I'm giving it to you and I'm telling you that it's going to be on the quiz and on the final. So I do not want anyone to be like, we never looked at it, we never talked about it, I didn't know this was important. I'm informing you that this is something that's going to come up. So I look forward to seeing this being done correctly by everyone. All right. So that brings us to the end of chapter 11. So we are going to end this video here, and we'll pick up when we talk about chapter 12, which of course is looking at a little bit of the history, but then looking at how individual officers and juvenile justice kind of comes about, that kind of thing. So anyway, thank you very much. I will see you all in the next video. Bye.